Hello everybody, this is Kenton Taylor Howard, and I am from the University of Central Florida. I'm a Text and Technology PhD candidate and an instructor in the Games and Interactive Media program, and this presentation is called Teaching Game Design in a Pandemic. So, the game design class that I teach at the University of Central Florida, where I'm a full-time instructor, is a 4,000 level class. And to clarify what the kind of structure and content of the class looks like, because obviously the term game design, pretty broad, that can mean a lot of things, right? Most of the class focuses on theories about game design. Some of it focuses on actually creating games, and a lot of it also focuses on people learning how to create design documentation like art style guides and game design documents and things like that. UCF is a very large institution, so the classes in our program are also very large. So typically a section of this class is somewhere in the 80 to 100 student range, and it's usually junior to senior level students. The class itself is a mixed mode class. So to clarify, there's in-person class meetings and online content, and I did teach the class with face-to-face class sessions during fall 2020. We just took pandemic precautions like face coverings and social distancing and things like that. One of the main roles of this class in our program is to introduce students to working in groups with other students. Most of the classes after this class feature a heavy amount of group work. This program mostly focuses on video game design, and most modern video games are made with teams of people because of the amount of content that you need to create for them. So we, in future classes, ask them to make video games in teams, and this class is kind of the first class where they get their feet wet building games in a team with other students. The structure of the class is also really heavily informed by an article by Eric Zimmerman called How I Teach Game Design. Zimmerman is a pretty well-known video game scholar. And one of the things Zimmerman argues for in this text, which other scholars have echoed too, so people like Tracy Fullerton have also said things like this as well, that one really good way to introduce people to game design, and specifically doing things like creating good mechanics for games and coming up with an aesthetic that fits the game's story and things along those lines, is to have students use paper prototyping and board games and things like that. So the question might come up, why not have people make video games if this is a video game design program? And this is something that Zimmerman's trying to kind of push against and say, you don't need to always make digital games to learn game design. And actually, one of the main thrusts that he kind of goes for in this article that, again, other scholars have echoed, is that when we want people to learn about game design theory and like how to do things like, for example, create, a fighter class, a rogue class, and a wizard class, and make sure that those classes all have balanced power levels, and there's not going to be a problem of like the wizard being way more powerful than everybody else, and so why doesn't everybody just pick a wizard when they play this game? The idea is like we can take programming and code out of that equation. We don't necessarily need to think about how to write variables and functions and all the kinds of things that you do in computer programming. We can think about how do I make these character classes balanced so when people play this game they enjoy it. And so our game design class works in a very similar way. There are plenty of other classes in our program that do ask students to create video games and use code and things like that. But this one, we try to really strictly focus on paper prototyping, board games, and taking the programming and the code out of the equation so that we can put more of the focus on game design. So in what a lot of us I found are referring to now as the before times, this is kind of what the assignments in the class looked like. And I'm only really talking about the group projects here. There are a couple of solo projects in the class as well, but since like at least half of the class centers on these group projects, I want to mostly focus on those in this presentation. So the first group project asks students to work together, and I usually have about a 4 to 5 person team for these teams, to create a paper prototype or a simple board game that recreates elements of a actual video game. So the idea is that they pick a video game and they try to not recreate the entire game, but recreate some element of that game. So for example, I think the example I use in the assignment is the classic first-person shooter game Doom, and I say maybe you could come up with a tabletop version of Doom that allows people to play like deathmatch versus each other, but isn't necessarily the entirety of the original video game Doom. So maybe, you come up with mechanics for how the weapons work and how people move and how they deal damage to each other and stuff like that. The second group project asks them to create a simple board game and this time to recreate a classic story. So the idea is they need to pick an existing story. I really try to stress in particular no video games for this. I want non-interactive stories. And I try to also push them toward things that haven't been made into board games before. But one example I give them is, what if we're creating a board game based on the Three Little Pigs? So you've got that original story, and maybe you have to come up with mechanics for how durable each of the different houses that the pigs build made, how much damage the wolf does to them, how the wolf wins, how the pigs win, etc. In all these cases in the before times, the way I would do this is have students actually make these games and then bring them to class to demonstrate to everybody else, and we'd have like a gameplay day, basically, where people would show up, show off their games, and then people would play each other's games. It was always really fun. And the problem is that obviously this structure is not safe because of the pandemic. I can't really ask students to make physical board games in groups because that requires them to gather together in a room, which would not necessarily be safe. And I can't also ask them to come to class physically with their games and to play each other's games because that would require a whole bunch of people congregating and intermingling around tables. And again, something that's not safe right now due to the pandemic. So my approach here was to basically convert most of the assignments in this class into digital tabletop games. So what I asked them to do instead is create digital tabletop versions of these physical assignments. And we had a lot of discussions about how to be game designers in a pandemic. We talked a lot about what these assignments used to look like. So I actually, kind of showed them basically this, what the assignments were in the before times. And then we had a discussion as a class about, okay, how as game designers are we going to solve problems like this? Situations where people can't physically gather to play games anymore. And so I was drawing to some extent on my experience as a Dungeons & Dragons player here. And I say Dungeons & Dragons has totally helped me and informed me as a teacher many times in my life as a teacher. So this was another time that happened. But some people might be asking, what is a digital tabletop program? This is something that, like, if you're a D&D player, you might be very familiar with. If you've never played a game like that before, you might not have any kind of clue of what this sort of thing is. So very broadly, these are online digital platforms that allow players to connect together and play board games. So you can take something like Monopoly and play it with your friends online. There's a really wide variety of these. So in terms of what a digital tabletop program looks like and how it's formatted and structured and stuff, that depends on the service, and there are tons of them. There's some key qualities I think that they do have in common. The pricing structure, so whether or not they're free, whether they're web-based or not. Some of them are things you can do in a web browser. Some of them require you to download a separate program. How complicated they are. So there's some that are reasonably simple and you can learn pretty quickly. There are some that are pretty complex. And when I pitched this to students, I actually told students, I'll allow you to use any program you want as long as you get it approved by me first. But I made two suggestions based on my experience doing this in the past. And the two I suggested were Roll20 and Tabletop Simulator, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But I picked these two platforms in particular because they're either cheap or free. They have pretty light system requirements and will run on almost any computer. And they're pretty simple to get started with and start building games in. So I will say, again, I allowed students to use any other program, but every single student group chose one of these two programs. So they were all working with one of these two. So what's Roll20? If you play D&D, you may be familiar with Roll20, or you may have at least be able to take a guess at what it is. It's a tool that was originally at heart created to allow people to play Dungeons & Dragons online with their friends. And Roll20 has some pretty significant advantages in that it's completely free, although there's a bunch of purchasable paid content that you can get for it. So, for example, the company that makes Dungeons & Dragons has officially licensed content for Roll20, and you can buy it, and it just directly imports into your Roll20 game. One advantage of Roll20 is that it's web-based. That means you can basically play an entire game of Dungeons & Dragons in your web browser. Most people do use an external program for handling voice chat because the in-browser option isn't very good. It just doesn't handle voice chat very well. So you often see people use like Skype or Discord or something to supplement Roll20 and allow people to talk more easily. And Roll20 is a pretty simple program to learn, so that's one major benefit of it. Most of the tools for it are geared toward Dungeons and Dragons, so it's definitely possible to make and play things that aren't Dungeons and Dragons in the system, and I had students make some pretty creative and pretty interesting stuff. But that being said, the way I would kind of describe this to students is that there's probably going to be like some sort of Dungeons and Dragons DNA in your game if you use Roll20. Like, that's what the tool's intended for, and because of that, it's likely that like your game will have some similarities to D&D. There's going to be some things that are, overlapping. Here's a screenshot of Roll20. This is actually from a game that I've been recently playing with my friends, so you can kind of see some key characteristics of it. We've got this like grid-based structure here. This is where you like move your character tokens. These individual little images you're seeing here are character tokens. They're standing on a map. You can see some dice rolls going on the right side of the screen. So the tool has different methods that you can use to roll dice and keep track of gameplay statistics and all that kind of stuff. So to shift gears a little bit to Tabletop Simulator, similarly, digital tabletop tool made for playing board games with your friends online. It's not free, so unlike Roll20, this is something that you do have to pay for. That being said, the standard price that I've seen for Tabletop Simulator tends to hover around $20 on websites like Steam. There are also very frequent sales on it. Like pretty much every time Steam runs a sale, Tabletop Simulator goes on sale like 75% off, so you can get it very cheaply. There's also bundle packages of the game that contain like multiple copies, so you can buy copies for your friends and stuff like that. So that made it pretty ideal for the class in the sense that it was something that was probably in most students' price range, and they could easily arrange buying it for everybody in the group if that's what they needed to do. Biggest difference between Tabletop Simulator and Roll20 is probably that it's a standalone program, so you have to download Tabletop Simulator and install it on your computer. The system requirements are very light, though. It can run on almost any operating system. The developers have made it very flexible. And there's a huge variety of free and paid content for it online. It's one of the most long-standing and most popular digital tabletop tools. So, for example, if you're interested in playing Monopoly or playing Trouble or something like that, you can probably find all the resources necessary to like import Trouble into Tabletop Simulator and then play it with your friends. It's a pretty simple tool to learn. Most of its tools are generated, geared and generated towards simulating physics, I guess. So there's a lot of tools for, like, for example, simulating the roll of a die across a table. Or there's lots of tools for, like, grabbing game pieces with a digital hand and, like, moving them around on the game board. There's even a flip the table option that like simulates launching the table into the air and like throwing everything across the room, and that's like one of the most popular ways to end a Tabletop Simulator session. So if you've ever played it before, you've probably seen that. Here's a screenshot of Tabletop Simulator. This is a good example of like what a setup in Tabletop Sim might look like, and it does a good example of showing off how it's kind of like a physics simulation. So here, like, there's literally someone who stacked up a bunch of dominoes, and those dominoes are probably falling over on the screen if this was like a live in-engine like screenshot. So the assignments in COVID times, to give you an idea of like how I've modified those now that you kind of get the basic picture of what they used to look like. The way they've basically been changed now is that in both cases I asked them to make a digital board game prototype. So recreate elements of a video game using Tabletop Simulator or Roll20. Just the big thing I told them is that they were not allowed to make an actual video game. It had to be like a digital board game. So I did not want them to use like a game engine like Unity to make, their own recreation of Doom. I wanted to see a board game version of Doom. We're just playing it on a digital tabletop. And similarly for the second project, it was recreate a classic story using a digital board game tool. No video game. So I don't want a video game on the Three Little Pigs. I want a digital board game version of the Three Little Pigs. One of the challenges with this, obviously, is recreating the experience of people getting to share their games with each other and like getting to play their games live and stuff like that, since that was no longer safe to do. And so one of the things I did was added a gameplay video demonstration to basically all of the projects. So all the projects in the class, I asked students to record a video of themselves playing the game. If they have friends or family members or something that they feel like they have like a pod with that they can be safe from things like COVID, then play it with a group of your friends. But otherwise, show it off by yourself if that's the easier way for you to do it. And then I usually, for every assignment, would give them a discussion post extra credit assignment where they could share those games with the class. So they could still get that experience of like sharing what they made with other people. For the group projects, I also required a live digital gameplay demonstration. So basically, the team had to set up a time with me to show me a live gameplay demo. So, and the reason I kind of pushed them toward that is like I didn't want to just see a pre-recorded gameplay demonstration where everything goes right. I want to see it live and be able to see like the organic version of it where things might go wrong, and I can ask questions, and I can maybe even participate. Like sometimes I would actually join the game and not just watch on Zoom or Skype and try to play a little bit of it, or at least like do a couple dice rolls or something. So to look toward the future, the structure seemed to work pretty well. Like students really seemed to enjoy making digital versions of board games. Some of the games they made were quite complex and quite impressive from like a visual and game design standpoint. I'm teaching 2 sessions of this class again in fall 2021, and because of uncertainty about what COVID precautions are going to look like in fall 2021, I'm definitely, at least for this next semester, going to maintain this structure for the class. I would like to return to physically making games and having people come in and play them once that's safe, because that was something students really enjoyed. But like the digital option was so successful that like I'd like to continue it in some form in the future. Maybe if nothing else, I'll keep it as a backup option in case we face another situation like this in the future. And I might also just offer both options, like let people pick between them. I might have them make one physical game and one digital game. I'm open to suggestions on that, honestly. So if you have thoughts on that, feel free to get in touch with me. But regardless, if this is something that sounds interesting to you, I would definitely suggest trying the structure if you teach game design. And if you're just struggling in general with how to do something like this in the pandemic, I think that this is potentially a way to solve that problem. So I thank you for listening to me today. If you want to get in touch with me, here's my contact information. The easiest way to reach me might be either via email or via Twitter or something like that. And feel free to check out my website if you want to see some other examples of my work. Thank you very much for listening today.